Welcome back, deep divers. Here on Occult Archives, we really like to pull back the curtain and look at history's most, well, let's say, interesting books.
Interesting is one way to put it.
We've got mystical grimoires, ancient religious secrets, things people thought were too dangerous, too powerful to even read.
Forbidden knowledge, that kind of thing. Right up our alley.
Exactly. But we're not just here to give you a quick summary. We like to think of this as giving you a shortcut. Like, how do you get to the core of what these books are really saying?
Without needing years of study and a secret society membership.
Right. So today, episode 227, we are diving deep into forbidding truths, hidden masters, and the occult path to superhuman consciousness. We're tackling The Way of Initiation by Rudolf Steiner, published way back in 1908.
A classic of esoteric literature, for sure. And this particular version we are looking at has its own little story. It was translated by Max Guise and first hit the English-speaking world in 1910.
Okay, so we're talking over a century ago. This stuff has been around for a while.
Oh, yeah. And get this. The publisher, the McCoy Publishing and Masonic Supply Company, they even put a note in there about how they tried to, quote, Americanize the language.
Americanize it? How do you even do that with occult teachings?
Well, they wanted to make these, and again, I'm quoting wonderful truths, clearer for the Western mind. Especially those folks interested in the whole, occult, theosophic, Masonic, New Thought scene.
Interesting. So they were trying to bridge a gap between European esotericism and American readers.
Something like that. Oh, and we can't forget the cover art. It's William Blake's Mary Magdalene at the Sepulchre. Pretty striking image, right?
It is. Very evocative. Seems to hint at themes of revelation, inner transformation, that sort of thing.
For sure. And speaking of revelation, we've got another key element here. The introduction by Edouard Chouret, translated from French, of course.
Chouret. Now, his perspective seems pretty important, right? He's the one who wants to set the record straight about mystics and occultists.
Exactly. Wants to push back against all the stereotypes, the whole fools and charlatans thing. Sadly, there have been some shady figures throughout history that have kind of reinforced that image.
Makes sense. So before we go any further, let's get Chouret's definitions on the table. He's laying the groundwork for how we understand Steiner's whole approach. What exactly does Chouret say makes a mystic a mystic?
Okay, so according to Chouret, the true mystic, and I emphasize true here, they're all about going deep into their inner world, full immersion.
So it's an inward journey.
Exactly. And through super focused meditation and some pretty serious self-discipline, they start to unlock new abilities within themselves. They reach, let's call it enlightenment.
Okay, and this enlightenment allows them to
really grasp the nature of their own soul and how it connects to, well, what Chouret calls the impalpable element.
Impalpable element, that's pretty vague.
He also calls it the eternal and supreme reality, which, basically boils down to the divine, some kind of ultimate source.
Right. Okay, so that's the mystic. Solitary exploration, seeking the divine within. Now, what about the occultist? How do they fit in?
Right. So the occultist, they're similar to the mystic in that they're seeking truth, but their method, it involves intuition and this kind of intellectual synthesis. They're looking at nature, observing, reasoning, and they see this divine outpouring.
Divine outpouring.
It's like this creative energy that flows through everything. The occultist sees it in nature, but also in humanity itself.
Interesting. So they're not just studying dusty old books or chanting in a cave.
Not necessarily. Chouret actually quotes Paracelsus here, the famous alchemist and physician. Paracelsus had this idea that every being is like a letter in an alphabet. And humanity, well, we're forming conscious word of life. Pretty cool image, huh?
Very cool. So we have the mystic gazing inward and the occultist studying the outer world, but both are trying to connect with the divine, this underlying principle.
Right. Now, in terms of their methods, the mystic, they use concentration, deep focus, inner vision.
Like a mental microscope.
Yeah. The occultist, on the other hand, they lean on intuition and this ability to synthesize information from lots of different sources. But Chouret, he's very clear that these aren't hard and fast categories. The really advanced folks, the adepts, the higher initiates, they blend these two approaches.
They become a kind of hybrid, using both inner and outer knowledge.
Exactly. Now, Chouret, he spent some time talking about why these figures, the mystics, the occultists, once so respected, why they've kind of gotten a bad rap in recent centuries.
Yeah, it's a good question. Why do we tend to think of them as suspicious or, a little bit out there?
Well, Chouret's theory is that it's all about focus. See, for the last couple hundred years, especially since the 1600s, Humanity has been obsessed with conquering the material world.
The rise of science, technology, all that.
Right. And to do that, he says we kind of had to put our transcendental faculties on the back burner, those abilities to perceive beyond the physical. We've been really good at observing the material world, but maybe lost sight of the spiritual dimension.
So it's like we traded one kind of sight for another.
Maybe. But Schure insists that those transcendental abilities, they never fully went away. They were kept alive by a select few, kind of operating under the radar. And now, he thinks, they're starting to reemerge in new ways. He even goes so far as to say these abilities are the foundation of all great human achievements.
Wow. So the insights of great thinkers, artists, even inventors, it all comes back to these subtle faculties.
That's Schure's argument. He says you can't have true genius without a touch of inner vision, that deeper intuition, which, of course, leads us to Rudolf Steiner.
The man of the hour. And Schure definitely sees Steiner as the embodiment of both the mystic and the occultist.
Oh, yeah, a perfect blend. He paints a picture of Steiner's childhood, serious, focused kid growing up in Austria. And then as a young man, he starts having these marvelous intuitions, but also terrible trials, which is kind of intriguing.
Terrible trials. Now, I'm curious about those.
Me too. Unfortunately, Schure doesn't really elaborate. But he does highlight Steiner's early awareness of what he calls the twofold current. The idea that there's this constant interplay between the visible and the invisible, a key concept in esoteric thought.
The seen and the unseen constantly intermingling, that's a big one.
It is. And for Steiner, it wasn't something he figured out intellectually. It was a direct perception, like an inner knowing. But at the same time, he also developed a strong rational mind. He studied Kant, Fichte, Schelling, even dipped his toes into Hegel.
So not just a mystic, but a philosopher, too.
Right. But ultimately, his scientific side took over. He was drawn to what he saw as the more solid ground of math, chemistry, mineralogy, that kind of thing. He even felt those fields gave him a better foundation for understanding the universe than just history or literature alone.
Fascinating, a true polymath. And he wasn't shy about writing either. Schure mentions Steiner's earlier works, things like Die Mystik, Das Christentum als mystische Tatsache. I know, those are a mouthful.
They are. And of course, his big work, Geheimwissenschaft. Occult science.
Right. All of this sets the stage for Steiner's own exploration of what he calls the superphysical world. But I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking, hold on, how do we know any of this is true? How do we test it? How do we know it's not just, fantasy or wishful thinking?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Steiner addresses it head-on. He knows we live in a skeptical age. We want proof, we want evidence, we want to experience things for ourselves.
You're not just going to take someone's word for it.
Exactly. So when he talks about the soul, the spiritual world, he understands that people are going to demand a way to verify these claims. And he makes a really interesting comparison. He says, for the mystic, the knowledge of the superphysical world is as real as, say, a traveler's experience in a far-off land. They've been there, they've seen it, it's real to them.
Even if most people haven't had that same experience.
He even quotes Annie Besant here, the theosophist. She had this analogy about an explorer who goes to Africa and comes back with these detailed descriptions, but people who'd never been there refuse to believe him. But their ignorance doesn't invalidate the explorer's experience, right?
It's just a different level of knowing.
Exactly. So for Steiner, the mystic's experience is their evidence. And he goes on to say that to really understand this spiritual stuff, you need a certain kind of inner development, what he calls a reverent approach. You can't just analyze it with the, ordinary mind, the lower mind, as he calls it.
So you need to approach it with the right attitude.
Exactly. He even talks about why these truths are shared at all if so many people can't grasp them yet. He's basically saying, look, I'm writing this book to show that there's another way of knowing. It's not less valid than science, it just operates on a different level. It's like expanding the scope of science to include the spiritual.
Okay, so we've established that there's this other way of knowing, the spiritual knowledge. But how do we access it? How do we actually experience it? What about all those groups and schools we hear about, the mystery schools, occult orders, all that?
Right. Steiner talks about those. He acknowledges that there are lodges, schools, occult schools where these teachings are passed on. But he also addresses the whole secrecy thing. He uses a great analogy. He says, occult knowledge is like writing to someone who can't read. It's not that the knowledge is deliberately hidden. It's that you need the right tools to access it.
You need to learn to read the language of the spirit.
Precisely. And anyone who's willing to put in the work, to follow the right method can potentially become a disciple. Now, what about that idea of finding a master? That's a big one in esoteric circles.
Yeah, you always hear about the seeker needing to find their guru, their spiritual guide.
Right. Well, Steiner's a little different on this. He says that while some folks do find a master, he believes anyone who earnestly strives for this knowledge will actually be found by an initiate. He talks about the strict laws governing this process. Real spiritual knowledge, it's never withheld from someone who's truly worthy, but you don't receive it until you're ready.
So it's not about who you know, it's about your inner state.
Exactly. He even uses the image of a wall around the order of initiates. You can be physically close to them, but that wall remains until you've done the inner work.
Makes sense. Now, Steiner really emphasizes what he calls the path of devotion or veneration. Why is this so important for him?
Well, he sees it as the bedrock of discipleship. He even points to how children naturally have this sense of awe and reverence for people they look up to. And he says that feeling, when it comes from the heart, it's a huge asset on this path. It's not about being subservient. It's about having deep respect for what is truly worthy of respect.
So it's about recognizing something greater than yourself.
Yes. And he even compares it to rubbing a glass rod to create electricity. You know, you need the right materials, the right conditions. Well, true devotion, it acts like that. It helps you generate the inner qualities you need for the path of knowledge. Without it, Steiner says, you're going to struggle from the very beginning.
Interesting analogy. And he even points out a potential obstacle to developing the sense of devotion in the modern world.
Yeah. He thinks our current age, it's so focused on criticism, on intellectual analysis, that it actually hinders our ability to experience true reverence.
We've overdeveloped our critical mind, maybe at the expense of our heart.
Maybe. And so Steiner's point is that anyone seeking higher knowledge in this day and age needs to actively cultivate this sense of devotion, not just by studying, but by how they live their lives, choosing to see the good, choosing to refrain from harsh judgment.
So it's a deep inner transformation, not just an intellectual exercise.
Exactly. It's got to be more than just outward shows of respect. It's about a change in your soul, in your mind. Every time you choose to put aside a negative thought, to focus on the good, you're moving closer to that state of devotion and opening yourself up to higher knowledge.
And this shift in attitude, it leads to what Steiner calls the path of discipleship.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting. He talks about it as this quiet inner transformation. You know, on the outside, you might still be going about your daily life, but inside, your whole orientation is changing.
Your inner world is being rearranged.
Right. And at the center of it all is this deep devotion for all things truly worthy of veneration. And this devotion, it actually changes how you perceive things. Steiner even talks about the aura, how it changes colors as you develop these inner faculties.
The aura, that's the subtle energy field around a person.
Yes. And he also talks about the need to kind of step back from the constant stimulation of the outer world and cultivate a richer inner life.
So less time on our phones, more time in contemplation.
Something like that. And it's not just about pleasant experiences either. Steiner warns against just indulging in pleasure, letting it carry you away. He says you have to work on these experiences inwardly, consciously transform them. Otherwise, he says, your ego can get hardened.
It's like you need to digest your experiences, not just consume them.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And he has this really key principle of occultism. He says, seeking knowledge just for personal gain, it actually takes you further from the path.
So it's not about becoming some kind of superhuman for your own ego.
No. True occult knowledge. It's about serving humanity, helping others. Every idea that does not become an ideal for you slays a power within you, Steiner says. And every idea that becomes an ideal creates a vital force.
Powerful stuff. So once someone has cultivated this right attitude, this sense of devotion, what's the next step?
Well, that's where Steiner starts giving more practical instructions, kind of like exercises for developing these inner faculties. But he stresses that these aren't just made up. They're based on ancient wisdom, principles agreed upon by true occult teachers. And one of the first things he says is create moments of inward calm, and in these moments, learn to distinguish between the real and the unreal.
Sounds almost like meditation.
It is. And he actually mentions that these teachings were originally expressed in symbols, a kind of sign language. So there's a deeper meaning behind the words. But in terms of those moments of calm, he says even 5 minutes a day can be enough if you do it right.
So it's about making time for quiet reflection.
Exactly. And during that time, you try to view your experiences from a higher perspective. He suggests looking at your own joys, sorrows, even your actions as if they belong to someone else, like you're observing them from a distance.
To get some objectivity.
Exactly. Yeah. He even uses the analogy of looking at a landscape from within it versus seeing it from a hilltop. You get a different perspective. And the point of this practice, he says, is to develop a sense of inner calm, a kind of magical force that allows your higher faculties to emerge.
So by quieting the mind, we create space for something deeper to come through.
Exactly. And this inner calm, it doesn't just stay in those meditation moments. Steiner says it starts to affect your whole life. You become calmer in general, less reactive, less easily thrown off by external events.
You develop a kind of inner stability.
Right. And this changes how you interact with the world. You become less influenced by external pressures and more guided by your own inner wisdom. It's a gradual process, but he says it can lead to a real transformation.
That makes sense. And he also talks about gaining control over how external impressions affect us. Like we can actually choose how we respond to things.
Yeah. He says that with practice, you can actually determine how those outer events impact your inner state. Like you can take the sting out of an insult or turn impatience into an opportunity for observation.
That's a pretty powerful skill to develop.
It is.
Yeah.
But it requires that inner foundation of calm. Steiner's point is that you can't just change your outward circumstances. You got to do the inner work. Develop that higher self, what he calls the inner ruler. And then those external things, they only affect you if you let them. It's a kind of mastery.
So it's not about becoming immune to the world. It's about choosing how you respond to it.
Right. And he talks about how this inner victory can sometimes come suddenly after you've been working at it for a while, like a breakthrough.
Interesting. So it's not always a gradual, linear process.
No, sometimes there are jumps. And then Steiner encourages us to move beyond just our personal concerns. He says we should start thinking about things from a purely human perspective, not just as individuals, but as part of humanity as a whole.
Expanding our circle of awareness.
Right. And this, he says, starts to connect us to higher worlds. We begin to realize that we belong to something larger than ourselves. And we learn to listen to those quieter voices inside, the ones that come through in moments of stillness.
So it's about tuning in to a different frequency.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this inward contemplation, it's not passive. Steiner says you have to actively engage with the world of thought. He encourages us to develop a real desire for calm, clear thinking, to see thoughts as real things, almost like entities with their own power.
So we're not just drifting off into daydreams.
No. He calls it meditation or contemplative thought, and he sees it as the primary way to gain true spiritual knowledge. But it has to be focused, disciplined. He warns against just chasing feelings or getting lost in vague ideas. And he recommends reading spiritual literature, mystical, Gnostic, theosophical texts to kind of nourish the mind.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And he says true meditation, it can totally transform you. It gives you a new understanding of reality, a new set of values. And it helps you see the connections between your everyday actions and the bigger picture, the cosmic unfolding. And that gives you strength to deal with life's challenges. You're not just going through the motions anymore.
Right. You know why you're here, why you're doing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And he recommends seeking guidance from experienced teachers, gurus, if you can find them. Ultimately, he says meditation can unite you with the spirit, the eternal part of yourself that's beyond birth and death.
That's a big claim.
It is. And he actually lays out 3 main stages on this path, which he calls probation, enlightenment, and initiation. And just to be clear, these aren't always strictly sequential. They can overlap a bit.
So it's not like climbing a ladder. It's more like a spiral.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
But let's start with probation, the first stage. What does this initial phase of training involve?
Okay, so probation. This is like boot camp for the spirit.
Kind of. It's about really working on your inner life, developing your mental and emotional discipline. Steiner says this is necessary to equip what he calls your spiritual body. Think of it as your subtle energy body, the part of you that can perceive and act in the spiritual realms. And one of the key things you work on is developing your awareness of certain processes in the natural world.
What kind of processes?
Well, it starts with observing the cycles of growth and decay.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is constantly going through these cycles, expanding, flourishing, then fading and dissolving.
Birth, life, death, we see it all around us.
Right. But usually we're not really paying attention. Steiner says you have to consciously focus on these processes, really immerse yourself in them. For example, when you see something growing, a plant, a tree. Really focus on that. Block out all other thoughts. Let that experience fill you up.
So it's a kind of mindful observation.
Exactly. And then let that thought, that feeling, resonate within you. Withdraw your attention from the outer world and focus on what's happening inside. But don't ignore the physical senses. Observe the object carefully first, then move inward. And he says it's important to do this with both growing things and decaying things.
To experience both sides of the cycle. And what happens when you do this consistently?
Steiner says you start to have these new thoughts and feelings, things you weren't aware of before. And the more you practice, the stronger they get. And just as natural forces shaped our physical senses, these inner exercises, they actually start to develop your spiritual senses, your ability to see into the spiritual world. He even describes a kind of feeling that comes with this practice. It's like when you contemplate growth and expansion, it feels similar to the feeling of sunrise. And when you focus on decay and decline, it's more like the feeling of moonrise.
That's a really poetic way to put it.
It is. And he says that these feelings, they actually become forces within you that help open you up to the spiritual world, the astral plane. And he talks about the importance of sound, too.
Sound?
Yeah. He makes a distinction between sounds from inanimate objects like a rock falling and sounds from living beings. And he says you should really focus on the sounds of living creatures, trying to feel their inner experience, whether it's pleasure or pain.
So it's about developing a deeper empathy.
Exactly. And he says to extend this to all of nature, to really listen to the world around you. He believes that nature speaks to us through sounds. And with practice, we can learn to understand that language.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
It is. And when it comes to human speech, he says you have to cultivate absolute inner stillness. When someone's talking, don't immediately agree or disagree, judge, or even accept. Just listen.
Silence the inner critic.
Exactly. And practice this even when you hear things that go against your beliefs. It's about developing a pure, unbiased listening. He also briefly mentions crystals, but warns against some of the popular interpretations of crystal work.
Like crystal gazing and all that.
Yeah, he says that's not really aligned with true esoteric teaching. And then he talks about color, how the physical world actually has a very limited range of colors compared to the spiritual world.
So there are colors we can't even imagine.
Right. And as you develop your spiritual senses, you start to perceive these colors. And you might even start encountering beings from the spiritual realms. He strongly recommends having a teacher at this stage because things can get pretty intense. And he also talks about the need to cultivate compassion, to really expand your empathy for all beings.
So it's not just about developing powers, it's about becoming a better person.
Exactly. And patience is key. Steiner warns against pushing yourself too hard, trying to force things. It's a gradual process. He says the teacher can often see the student's progress before the student is even aware of it. So don't get discouraged if you don't see results right away.
That's encouraging.
Yeah. And he reminds us that we don't need to do anything fancy or mysterious. It all starts with our ordinary thoughts and feelings. We just need to learn how to redirect them, to use them in a new way. The deepest mysteries, he says, are hidden within our own consciousness.
We just need to learn how to see them. Now, he actually gives a specific exercise, the seed contemplation. What's that about?
Okay, so you take a small seed and you place it in front of you. And then you really focus on it, trying to grasp all its qualities. You visualize it growing into a plant, and you hold that image clearly in your mind, and you understand that this imagined plant will eventually become a physical reality.
So you're kind of projecting its future form.
Right. And you compare it to, say, a fake plant, an artificial one. The fake plant, it doesn't have that inherent potential to grow, to become something more. And Steiner emphasizes the importance of feeling what you're thinking, really letting that feeling sink in. And if you do it right, he says you might start to perceive the seed differently. It might appear surrounded by a luminous cloud or a flame, and you might even get a glimpse of the future plant in its spiritual form.
So you're seeing beyond the physical.
Exactly. But he warns against getting caught up in fantasies. It has to be a clear, conscious experience. And then he gives another exercise, this one with a fully developed plant.
Okay, so what do you do with the plant?
Well, you stand before the plant and you think about how it's going to wither and die. You know, nothing of what I now see will endure. But then you also think about how it's going to produce seeds, which will create new plants.
Cycle continues.
Right. And you realize that there's something invisible within the plant that allows it to do that.
Yeah.
And if you really focus on that thought, you might start to see a kind of flame-like image coming from the plant. And this, he says, helps you develop the ability to see things in their process of becoming and decaying.
To see the spirit in all things.
Exactly. It's the beginning of understanding birth and death on a deeper level. And he acknowledges that there might be faster ways to achieve this, but this method, he says, is safer and more reliable for most people.
Okay, so we've got the seed, the plant.
Okay.
What's next?
This is where things get really delicate. He talks about the contemplation of human nature. But he stresses the importance of ethics here. He says, you have to have absolute sincerity in your own moral character to even attempt this.
So no manipulating people with your newfound powers.
Right. And he gives this golden rule of occultism. For every step you take in knowledge, take 3 steps in perfecting your character. And then he outlines an exercise where you observe someone who's experiencing a really strong desire, something they haven't attained yet. You try to become completely still inside, just observing them. And this, he says, should evoke a certain feeling in your own soul.
Like a resonance with their desire.
Right. And with enough practice, you'll be able to recognize that feeling immediately. And that feeling, in turn, will allow you to actually see their psychical state, their desire, as a kind of luminous image.
Wow, so you're actually seeing their inner state.
Yes. But Steiner warns against talking about these experiences too much, especially at first. He says our language is too limited to really describe them, and we risk distorting the experience by trying to put it into words.
So it's better to just keep it to yourself, at least initially.
Right. He also suggests observing someone whose wish has just been granted and noticing the difference in the image you perceive. But he stresses the importance of doing all of this with deep respect for the other person. You can't just treat them like an object of study.
It's about reverence for the human being.
Exactly. And he says that these practices, they can really transform you. You become more calm and confident, not just on the inside, but it shows on the outside too. And you start to see the connections between human nature and the universe as a whole.
It all starts to come together.
Right. And he emphasizes the importance of courage and fearlessness for the next stage, initiation. He says we should actively seek out opportunities to develop those qualities. Face challenges head on. Learn to control fear.
So it's not just about sitting in meditation, it's about how you live your life.
Exactly. And he says this is important because the higher mysteries, they reveal things that can be overwhelming if you're not prepared. He even compares it to seeing a hidden danger, something you weren't aware of before.
So you need to be strong enough to handle the truth.
Yes. And he talks about how the initiate eventually comes to see the forces of destruction and creation at work in the universe, the constant cycle of birth and death. And they see themselves as part of that process. It can be a lot to take in, but Steiner says you need to face it with courage and trust in the ultimate goodness of the universe.
It's not a path for the faint of heart.
No. He also talks about the importance of never giving up. No matter how many times you fail, you have to keep trying. He says there's an inexhaustible source of strength in the universe that we can tap into.
So it's about cultivating a deep resilience.
Yes. And finally, when the teacher sees that the student is ready, they'll be given what Steiner calls the names of things. He describes it as the key to higher knowledge. It's like learning the true language of the universe.
So it's not just about accumulating information, it's about understanding the essence of things.
Exactly. And then he talks about the stage of enlightenment, which builds on all of this preparation.
Okay, so we've done our time in boot camp. We've built up some strength and resilience. Now we're moving into enlightenment. What's that like?
Well, Steiner starts by distinguishing between people who have natural psychic abilities and those who have to develop them through training. He says both are valid, but the training route, it leads to a more conscious and reliable understanding.
So it's like the difference between talent and skill.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And once the student has learned the mystery language, the symbolic language of the spiritual world, they face another test. They have to prove they can act with freedom and certainty in those realms.
So it's not just about seeing things, it's about being able to navigate those realms effectively.
Right. And he says the ordinary duties of life, they don't go away. You still have to fulfill those. And in fact, your ability to do so should be enhanced by your spiritual training. But you also have new duties that come from the spiritual world, and you have to be able to discern those and carry them out with the same dedication.
So it's like juggling two worlds.
Exactly. And it describes this as the water trial, because in the higher worlds, there's no solid ground. You have to learn to swim, to rely on your own inner strength.
That sounds challenging.